Let me introduce our speaker. Nate Hagens is a world leader helping us to anticipate and plan for the multiple crises that are facing humanity in coming decades. He works extensively with students, business leaders, government officials, philanthropists, academics, and global citizens all over the world who are concerned about the existential threats facing civilization and what to do about them. Nate's career took a crucial turn about 20 years ago. After earning a master's in finance from the University of Chicago, he became an investment advisor in some of the biggest firms on Wall Street. And in the course of that, he became an expert on the petroleum industry. The more he learned about oil, the more he became concerned about its vital importance to the economy, as well as its looming scarcity. Most recently, he founded a podcast called The Great Simplification, which features thought-provoking interviews with forefront thinkers on how they see the future ahead for human beings. But Nate's voice is unique to me for three reasons. First, he stresses our innate drive as animals to capture as much energy as possible to create the surplus needed for reproduction. This is our basic animal nature. Second, he argues that our insatiable consumption of fossil fuels and the push toward endless economic growth are really just manifestations of this ancient animal drive, and therefore are exceedingly hard to tame. And third, he warns that debt is a claim on future physical resources and cannot increase without limit on a finite planet. His astute analyses of these three factors, biology, energy, and money, are themselves some of the most thought-provoking commentaries on the future of our species. The Earth Futures Institute is exceedingly honored to welcome Nate as our featured speaker today.
This is a famous Einstein quote that I never heard until recently. If I had an hour to save the world, I'd spend 55 minutes defining the problem and then 5 minutes finding the solution. And that has been what my work has been over the last 20 years. I'm trying to describe the boundaries and constraints of our system and pass the baton to people like you who have your own expertise and creativity and ideas on how to solve it. That's the goal of this. So we live in a society that rewards reductionist expertise. We have experts in all of these different areas, but these experts are effectively islands of expertise separated by oceans of nonsense or non-science. And these people rarely talk to each other, yet if you fly up high enough and look at our system from a bird's eye view, the parts and the processes combine and fit together, and there is a cohesive story of how everything fits together. And I'm going to attempt to do that very briefly today. So the human ecosystem is comprised of many parts, and this is not taught in Econ 101, but this is effectively what's happening. Humans have ideas, and we innovate, and we combine energy and materials into products, and we represent them by financial digits or linen in our pockets globally, and this is our economy. We do this all to generate feelings. As Sandy said, we are animals, and we're trying to match the same emotional states of our ancestors, and the entire system produces waste, not only CO2, but many other waste products. Energy, there's a topic, that two-word statement that I use in my materials, that our culture is energy blind. We don't realize how central our lives and our current lifestyles are to energy, particularly fossil energy. Every single thing that contributes to GDP or GWP, gross world product, started somewhere with a small fire. Every single economic good or service requires energy to invent, to mine, to refine, to manufacture, to run, to repair, to maintain, to dispose of. There is energy used at every stage of this process. So this is me on my farm. I do the work of around 1/10 of a horse. This is my horse, Binga, who does the work of one horse, if sufficiently motivated. This is my little Rhino utility vehicle, which with some gasoline does the work of around 45 actual physical horses. This is my truck with some diesel fuel, can do the work of 300 horses. This is all because this condensed ancient sunlight that we're pulling out of the ground, 1 barrel of oil has 1,700 kilowatt hours worth of work potential in it, which we're currently paying $73 in the global market for. And yet that 1,700 kilowatt hours, relative to me doing 0.6 kilowatt hours a day, does 4.5 years worth of my physical work. The next time you fly across the sky, imagine 100,000 invisible horses pulling your jet across the sky. This is the magnitude of this energy subsidy. So, how much energy do we use? The world economy uses 100 billion barrel of oil's worth of energy every year of coal, oil, and natural gas. So relative to Patrick, this is, or me, or anyone in the room, that's the labor equivalent of 500 billion human workers adding their labor force to a real human labor force of around 5 billion active workers. This is a massive subsidy that is not talked about in economic textbooks because all they value it is how much it costs to extract, and then they equate it to every other input in our economic system. So this is the story of industrialization, where we have added huge amounts at an energy inefficient way of low cost, essentially free fossil energy to machines to do things that humans used to do manually or with draft horses. That was the looms for weaving. Then we had the steam engines. Now aluminum smelting is one of the most energy intense activities on the planet. So this is a little bit of a math thing. I live in Wisconsin. It's a milk state. So historically, we would hand milk a cow. It would take 30 minutes to milk a cow. And let's just say conceptually that you would make $5 an hour. Then we have an intermediate energy intensive activity where there's machines that milk the cows. This uses 180 times more energy than the human itself, but the profits went up to $20 an hour. Then there are fully automatic milking machines that the human doesn't need to spend more than 1 minute per cow, and the machines do everything, but we need 400 times the extra energy added to this system, but our profits go up again to $25 an hour. And this $25 could be the profit, I mean the wage, or it could be the profit to the milk owner, or it could be given to the consumer in the form of really low milk prices. So what ends up happening though, this is the same graph, the blue is the same graph. The orange is when electricity goes from 5 cents to 10 cents per kilowatt hour, and you can see in the intermediate milking example, you have a small loss in your profitability, and in the really energy intensive example, you have a big loss in profitability. But what happens when energy prices triple? The low energy intensive human labor doesn't change at all because you're not using energy other than your own body. You have a sharper drop in the intermediate example, but in the high energy intensive activity example, you're now operating at a loss because you're adding so many units of what was once cheap fossil energy to a process that now is losing money. So we saw this happen in Germany in the last 6 months or so when the Russian invasion happened and boosted natural gas prices exponentially from what they had been. Thousands of chemical manufacturing, smelting, different industrial processes firms went out of business or were operating at a loss because they were optimized for just-in-time cheap energy inputs. This is a dry run for what I expect happening in coming decades, and I will get to that. So writ large, what this cheap fossil energy has done is allowed us higher wages as a global society, and distribution is another question, higher profits, lower price stuff, and it has boosted the number of people and the average consumption per person The human economy today, measured by number of people times consumption, is 500 times bigger. No, I'm sorry, it's 1,000 times bigger than it was 500 years ago. How much is that taught in our colleges? I mean, it is massive, massive difference than just 5 centuries ago. Economics classes teach that energy is equal to any other product in the production function. So if we have $1,000 worth of natural gas or liquid crude oil, it's worth $1,000 worth of clickers or cupcakes or hand sanitizer. And yet its contribution to the global economy is orders of magnitude more than its price. So this is the circular economy model that is currently still taught in Economics 101, that households, us, demand products. The firms get the signal, they develop the products, and it's this virtuous cycle between the firms and the households. What it's neglecting is the source of where all this input comes from in the economic process and the sink capacity. We're very familiar with CO2, but there's also endocrine disrupting chemicals. The ocean is absorbing. I mean, there's lots of environmental waste aspects. So we are, as a species, as a global culture, drawing down the principle of this fossil bank account that was trickle charged over tens and hundreds of millions of years by daily photosynthesis, but we're treating it as a narrative as if it were interest that's continual. We are all alive somewhere in between the blue and the red star on a 20,000-foot aerial view of what one day may be referred to as the carbon pulse, where we are drawing down this fossil bank account 10 million times faster than it was sequestered. And, this doesn't have to be a disaster. Most people, even if you're a young person in this room, you'll probably live your entire life above the line that I'm drawing. But this is an anomaly in human and planetary history that we're pulling this out rapidly. Oil, for now, is the economy. This is a logarithmic chart showing on the bottom the oil consumption per country, and on the left, the GDP per country. And this is a log chart. And you can see the R squared is 0.96. Oil, and now if you think back to the horse and the picture of Patrick and the 100 billion, you can imagine why this is the case. Oil and energy are important. Okay, what's the problem? Well, we've used the best first, and we have a lot left, but it isn't as powerful and available and cheap as it used to be. And there are also narratives around this. This is a chart showing United States oil production for the last 100 years. We had a peak in 1970, and then we declined for 40 years. And everyone's like, oh, and we developed new technologies, and we pierced that old peak. Technology overcame natural resource limitations. Drill, baby, drill. Okay? Here's the exact same graph, broken out by geological province. The green is the lower 48 conventional crude oil. The yellow is a non-contiguous geographic region, but it so happens to be part of the United States, which is the North Slope of Alaska. The blue is not even on land, it's underneath the ocean, the Gulf of Mexico, which is what we added to our production. And the red is the light tight oil. This is oil in the Bakken, the Permian. It's also called shale oil. This stuff it comes from the source rock, where all the other oil originated, and there's nothing left after that. So what we've done, we've used technology not to find more oil, but to create a wider straw, and we're that much closer to the slurping sound near the bottom. But we see this, and we're like, technology can solve everything. Well, let me talk about this red sliver briefly. So these are oil fields all of the oil fields in the United States that were drilled before 2014. In the orange is 2014, then 15, 16, 17, 18, all the way to 2021. What it shows is the decline rate of all the wells drilled in that year and how rapidly they decline. So you can see that we're having to drill more and run faster just to kind of stay in place. And if, for any reason, the United States stopped drilling oil for environmental reasons, for political reasons, for affordability reasons, our oil production would drop 40% in the first year and another 25% in the year after that. So we have to keep drilling at more and more expense to be even close to maintaining our production. A lot of countries in the world produce oil, but not so many countries also export a lot of oil, because countries like the United States, we're the top 3 oil producing countries. It's a misnomer because we're not producing the oil, we're just extracting it that Mother Nature produced. But we consume more than we produce. This graph here shows Russia exports 26% of the world's natural gas exports comes from Russia. 22% of the world's oil exports available for purchase in the world economy come from Russia. If you include Saudi Arabia, almost 50% of the world's oil that's available for countries to buy in the open market comes from those 2 countries. Think about what's going on in Europe right now and the long-term or even intermediate term or even short-term implications of that, where Biden goes to Saudi Arabia and is kind of snubbed by Prince, and Xi Jinping is going to Saudi Arabia, and Putin is going to Saudi Arabia. Energy for now is the world economy, and there's a geopolitical power shift going on. Briefly, and this would be a whole hour on itself, is okay, energy is important. Okay, our high quality energy is depleting. Well, what about other energy? What about technology like solar and wind and geothermal and nuclear? Yes, these things are viable, they're mature, they're robust, but they're really mineral energy. We're really trading low carbon for minerally intensive things that we have to rebuild every 25 years or so. So a oak tree is renewable, a chicken is renewable, a solar panel is rebuildable if we can have the complexity in 20 or 25 years. Point number 2, the vast majority of renewable energy produces electricity, but only around 20% of global energy use is electricity. So a lot of the other things we can change in the future with some costs. We can't change everything though. So there's a mismatch between what a joule or a BTU is and what it can do for our existing infrastructure. Then the other thing is we have these 500 billion fossil workers added to our economy every year. What is the role of renewables and technology as those fossil workers start to decline? Then the other thing is we say, oh, solar is really cheap at the margin if we add some to Santa Cruz, and this is true. But what if it's 20% or 30% or 50% or 70%? Then every additional percentage of penetration requires a full transmission accounting on how does the whole system work? How does the whole system cost? And what happens, not when some clouds disappear, but what happens when we have a month of weather without renewables? Do we build up that much backup? Do we keep the natural gas plants running as peaker plants? These are really complicated questions, and we tend in the media to just look at the surface answers here. Then the other problem is, if you care about climate change, which I deeply do, this rapid renewable energy growth that we've seen is not reducing the amount of carbon or emissions globally. But one of the things is called the Trinity, which is everything that results in GDP has energy, materials, and technology. We've talked a little about energy, but the material footprint is GDP is the orange line, and the material footprint is the purple line. GDP and materials are about 100% correlated. So if we double the size of our economy, we're going to double the need for copper and aluminum and other things. The global south and the inequities from capitalism, there's another big inequity coming that we're not talking about, which is that in order to decarbonize the world, we're going to have to rematerialize the world. And a lot of these minerals and materials that will be needed for a massive scale up of solar and wind, for example, come from areas that are already experiencing higher wet bulb temperatures, conflicts due to poverty, very high impacts from climate if you look at lithium, cobalt, and nickel in some of these areas. And so the global north just assumes that, we have these number of atoms in the world supply of reserves, and of course we're going to need those to have electric cars for everyone. And what that means is we're going to go and mine these countries that are already having conflicts and accelerating impact from climate change. Briefly on technology, there's two types of technology. One is how to make us use energy more efficiently, like a power plant, or we can invent some new solar panel that's more efficient. And the other type of technology is things that we invent that humans used to do by themselves or with draft animals, but now with a chainsaw, we can do it with a little bit of gasoline and some tools. This type 2 technology is the vast amount of technology. So technology itself does not help us use less energy because these new inventions end up being a new baseline for next period's energy consumption. In fact, over the last 200 years, we have gotten more efficient at using energy pretty much every single year. This is the gray line here. We get more and more efficient because we're smart and we're clever and we can combine things in different ways. But at the same time, look at the amount of energy that we've used. Since 1990, we have improved energy efficiency by 36%, but our total energy consumption has gone up 63%. This is also referred to as Jevons paradox, that things are cheaper and more efficient, we end up using more of them. Money. Money is created, yes, some by governments, but the vast majority is created by commercial banks when they make a loan. When they make a loan, there's an asset and a liability that from a financial perspective, the whole system is in balance. But from a biophysical perspective, the same amount of copper, and lithium, and dolphins and redwood trees existed as before that money was created. So all this new money, there's a creditor and a debtor. So from a human perspective, it balances. But from a natural world perspective, there are more claims on the same amount of stuff. Banks do not lend money, they create it. Another thing not taught in economics textbooks. Feelings. We are biological organisms that we don't go through our life saying, I want to have the most fitness, I want to have the most surviving offspring. There is not a direct connection. We go through our life today executing prior adaptations from our millions of generations of ancestors in order to get the same emotional state, the same neurotransmitters, endocrine cascade hormones of our successful ancestors in a wildly different material environment. We are adaptation executors. This person trading stocks is getting the same dopamine as someone in our ancient past looking to get a gazelle to bring home. A few other summary points on human behavior is we can get hijacked by the same emotional cues that led to success of our ancestors in a really targeted way. This is a screenshot from a video game called Overwatch where you compete against 100 other people and you try to survive. And a young person or an old person sitting on their couch playing this game, their body, their physiology feels like they are bringing a gazelle back to their tribe. But in reality, they're just accessing a coal-fired server on their mom's couch in the basement. And so these modern technology tricks us into what's actually going on. And so in ancestral times, we had a strong overlap between the virtual world in our minds and the physical world that we inhabited. But now there's very little overlap with our reality and what we experience with the internet and all these things. And this is a real problem, and this is a gap that education can potentially fill. But the reason is that humans, language is a relatively new thing, so we can utter millions of more word combinations than can exist in physical reality. But this is again why education is important, because so many of these self-perpetuating energy machines and colonizing outer space cheaply and for billions of people, all these things sound good to the human mind until you match them up against the biophysical laws of reality. So again, another thing is we have a difficulty distinguishing between what's relevant, which is oil depletion, climate change, biodiversity, and what's salient to our lives: fast cars, mating, beer, pizza, social media, these things. So we have steep discount rates. Sandy said we're animals. Animals have finite lifespans. Therefore, we care much more about the present than we do about the future. We also are midway between a tournament species and a pair bond species. And this means that we have historically cared greatly about status. This is Tiger Woods' yacht pulling into a marina where his ex-wife's new boyfriend's yacht is bigger than his. And Tiger is a billionaire, but can you just imagine what he was feeling at that point? This is part of our evolutionary heritage, is given the cultural cues of the day, we compare ourselves to others. And we live in a moment where we compare ourselves on pecuniary, material, monetary ways. That is plastic. That can change, but the comparing ourselves to others probably won't change. So that's the thing, is we live in a material world that is vastly richer than any other generation in history, yet we're constantly comparing ourselves to others and one-upping them. So we confuse absolute wealth with relative wealth. And absolute wealth is really what matters. And as young people in the audience, try to focus on how amazing the world is and how you have access to all the information in the world at your fingertips and everything else, instead of, oh my gosh, that person has the new handbag or the new shoes or the new things to flex with. I was 45 years old before I started to figure this out, and I still get pulled into it, but our culture markets us, you suck, if you buy this product, you'll be better, and it's a trap. We are incredibly tribal. We are out-group versus in-group, and this is who we are, and this has massive implications for the future. But we are not solitary jaguars or leopards. We are an eusocial or ultra-social species. My friend Jonathan Haidt says we're 95% chimp, 5% bee. We have a lot of relationships to the social insects in how we interact with our little pheromones, with emojis and texts and phone calls, etc. Our behaviors are plastic. That means we can change, but we're so social that we mirror what is accepted and what is the norm. Cultural evolution can happen at lightning speed. Pollution, main point is it's not just climate change. We've lost 70% of the animal populations, animal, birds, fish, and reptiles since I was born. We're losing sperm count in male humans and other animals around the world at around 1% a year, and that's accelerating. There are endocrine disrupting chemicals. There's all kinds of environmental impacts from the human enterprise. So, fitting this all together, what this does is it creates GDP, or globally gross world product. Our culture keeps score of our success, of how we're doing, by GWP, which is effectively a measure of how much energy we burn. They're 99% correlated. So gross world product might as well be called gross world burning, GWB. This is an aerial view of Los Angeles, and if you think about it, oil is functioning as the hemoglobin of our global transport system. And it's not too much of a stretch to imagine the brake lights and the headlights powered by gasoline, which comes from crude oil, being the arteries and veins of the global transport system. And this, of course, expanding that out to the different shipping and flight patterns. And so I wrote a recent paper that portrayed the narrative that humanity writ large, our entire culture globally, is functioning as an energy dissipating structure, that there is a metabolism to us finding, extracting, and using this energy. And we like to blame people, and certainly some people are at more fault than others, but the system itself has now outsourced all of our decision making to the financial markets. I know a lot of billionaires and I know a lot of politicians, and all of them don't know how to stop this. The market momentum is so strong that I fear we're not going to be able to intervene until there's a wake-up call, or until we have to. And that's what my work is trying to work on, is how to change the initial conditions of that moment. This is historically humans from left to right over time. we lived off the hydrological flows of the sun, the soil, the rain, and the productivity of the earth. Then a couple hundred years ago, we puzzled out how to drill and farm vertically instead of horizontally, and we pulled out all this ancient goodies from the past, and all this stuff has a different sort of shape. All these products, like aluminum or uranium or crude oil, from a big picture perspective, have a somewhat akin to a Gaussian distribution in their availability. They start with a little bit, and then you get better at it, and it becomes more useful in your economy, and you mine more and you find it, but then it eventually hits a peak, and then there's a lot left, but it's less concentrated, more costly, more diffuse, harder to get, etc. So there's a lot of these red curves. Then what we did is, this is the carbon pulse is pretty much one of those curves, and we're still on the upslope, but we're near the top of it. On top of this, we overlaid a different sort of curve, the monetary creation. We create money with a keystroke in commercial banks. So our money supply has not stopped growing. It continues to grow every year. And so if you integrate all these things together, old economists 100 some years ago did understand that land and land productivity mattered to our system, but over time we became so wealthy and progress and economic growth were increasing so rapidly that all that stuff was kind of sloughed away, and it just became capital and labor are how we explain our wealth and productivity. And using the social construct of credit, when we're in an economic hardship, rather than tighten our belts and use less, we create more money and solve the problem that way. We had sent out those stimulus checks in 2020. We did the central bank bazooka in 2009 that didn't let, other than Lehman Brothers, where I used to work, fail. And so what we do is we create credit that effectively, when you have no credit, you're at this point, when you create credit, you're effectively consuming what you would have one day consumed in the future today. And that's what we've been doing for 50 years. Since I've been on this planet, we as a country, we as a global society have increased our debt more than we've increased our GDP, which is the income stream needed to service and maintain the debt. So now our society views the world entirely through a financial lens. We've not only financialized the human experience, but also the explanation of it. And all key decision makers in our world are expecting this black line to continue, money and GDP. There are no plans for a smaller economy. All integrated assessment models in the climate literature in the IPCC, all of them, have different assumptions on emissions, different assumptions on technology, but they all assume that growth will continue this century. There is no credible institution or university or government body or corporation that is specifically planning for the end of growth. There is a fringe group of activists called the degrowth community that is advocating for degrowth. I do not think we are going to choose to degrow, but I think they're somewhat helpful in that it's an Overton window on how to think about a society without growth. So growth is really an anomaly in our species' history. There were two very long periods in the last 2,000 years where we had flat to declining growth, and we've been on a roller coaster upswing for the last 150 years. And all of our economic theories were invented in this last 40-year orgy of consumption and exponential growth. The highest productivity in global history was in the early 1970s, which simultaneously is exactly when oil production growth peaked. We still have above zero productivity, but the productivity is declining. So at some point in the coming decade, this is going to cross the zero line where we're going to have depleting fossil fuels, and technology is going to try to offset that with new inventions and stuff, but the total productivity, the total wealth, the total increase is going to be negative, probably. So currently we are papering over our problems with more and more credit, while the energetic and material basis of our currencies deplete. So under this framing, what is not likely to happen? Growing the economy and simultaneously mitigating climate change and the sixth mass extinction. Telling people to use less fossil fuels, given the metabolism of our situation, is similar to arguing with a forest fire. It's not going to work. It's not working. India is massively expanding their coal-fired power right now. Look at what Germany's doing. They have the largest energy, renewable energy on the planet. California is also up there. But they're not massively scaling renewable energy in response to this. They're restarting coal plants. They're worried about energy security rather than climate. I mean, they still are. They still care about climate, but they have no other option. They have to keep the lights on, et cetera. Growing the economy by replacing fossil fuels with renewables. That was never really going to happen. We are growing renewables faster than we're growing fossil fuels globally, but the magnitude, the total magnitude of what energy we use is still 82% fossil fuels, and it's been that way for 30 or 40 years. Culture en masse choosing to leave fossil carbon in the ground, governments embracing limits to growth before limits to growth are passed. Under this framing, what is likely to happen? Growth, as we were talking about this morning, the growth in gross energy, while the net energy, which is how much energy is left over for the rest of society to use, that's not in the energy sector, is going to decline, which means less for universities and hairdressers and casinos and NASCAR, or maybe we will choose to have casinos and NASCAR and not some other things. But we're going to have less surplus energy to be directed towards the pursuits that we've taken for granted. There's going to be, every time we hit a recession or worse, we're going to respond by massive money creation and giving of money to individuals. And that over time will hurt the credibility and the health of currencies. The Bank of Japan right now owns 50% of the bonds that the government of Japan has issued. Think about that. And it's only because our culture is energy blind that that doesn't scare the crap out of everyone. That government owns 50% of their own government debt, which they issued to get money to pay for stuff. It is the biggest Ponzi scheme in the history of this planet, is the biophysical disconnect between our monetary claims on reality and what the next 20 or 30 years of that reality is. Basic income support for more people, because as things get more expensive, we're going to have to help people that can't help themselves. This is going to be a central question in the coming decade. Probably a rightward shift in politics, because people care about where the bills are going to be paid and things like that. They're going to care less about esoteric things that are in the future, like many of us in this room care about, like climate change as one example. So I think there'll probably be less environmental regulations. Germany is resurrecting towns that were mothballed, that are coal-producing towns, this month to generate baseload electricity, even though they have a very solid environmental mindset. We're effectively going to be pedal to the metal until we hit a wall. Okay, I see two scenarios in the future. I'm going to talk about the first scenario, but let me give a little bit of a backdrop here. Some of you may think that this story I'm telling is Malthusian in nature. Well, 200 years ago, Thomas Malthus said some of the things I'm saying today, and also some other wrong things. He was wrong because he didn't know about fossil fuels. Paul Ehrlich wrote a book, The Population Bomb, in 1969 about some of these issues. He was wrong because he didn't know about globalization or debt, that we could pull resources forward in time. In 2009, the central banks of the world took over the role of monetary creation and backstop from the commercial banks. In 2020, we had this COVID thing, and we had this massive bazooka of government, Federal Reserve support. There's going to be some other cans to kick. So scenario one is that we come up with some new innovation that allows us productivity for a while longer, that it offsets our energy depletion, and some new invention, maybe the metaverse or blockchain or I don't know what, maybe nuclear fusion, will allow us to continue to grow for a while longer. However, that scenario is what I call the Mordor economy, because As net energy declines, more and more of our energy has to go to the energy sector. And I kind of say this as a thought experiment. I don't actually really think this will happen. But there could be a time in the future where 50% of our energy goes to finding and delivering energy, and the other 50% of our energy goes towards mitigating the environmental damage from the energy, meaning there's none left over for any other activity in society. Of course, that we would cease well before then, but that's the direction that we're headed. The other scenario is what I refer to as the great simplification, which is that when we remove this freely available, cheap credit that is ubiquitous in the world with a shift towards more costly energy resources like the shale oil I was talking about before, and with the return to complex, viable, but complex and costly solar contraptions with batteries and complexity, that the aggregate of all that doesn't mean we're running out of energy, but we will run out of the scale and the size and affordability of energy to continue our musical chair financial situation. And there will be a 1930s sort of event coming in the next decade is what I expect. And this is the scenario that I'm trying to help prepare society for. So this is a presentation that I gave to some politicians or adapted from. When we think about, let's be more sustainable. I hate the word sustainability because true sustainability that's a really hard, high bar to meet. I think we need to be more sustainable than we are today, but what does our destination look like in the future? Say Santa Cruz in 2050. What is the scale of what happens? What is the energy mix? What is the cultural aspiration? Like, what do we wake up in the morning and want to do? Is it make profits and buy stuff like it is today, or is it something different? Is there more equality? What does that look like? What is the environmental awareness and protection and dealing with ecosystems? What is the governance? So between here and there, we can't just look at there, and there are some big road closed signs between here and there. Some of them I didn't talk about today, which is the polarization of our social media and AI and ChatGPT and all this stuff. We're losing the ability to have these conversations with our fellow countrymen and women. So the social contract is at risk due to technology. The great simplification I talked to briefly about now is some sort of an economic rubber band snapping back towards our biophysical reality. What's happening right now between the US and Russia, I think there's a serious chance this year of a direct conflict with no longer the fig leaf of a proxy war of Ukraine between the US and Russia. And if that escalates and there's a nuclear exchange, even of a limited tactical nukes, that triggers some of the other risks that I've been talking about, the financial thing. So the US currently has the seigniorage, which is the economic benefits from having the world currency. And Russia is trying, and China are trying to invite the BRICS and Brazil and lots of countries in Asia and Africa to join a different system where they don't have to use the US dollar. So the global hegemony of the US is at risk. And the US is kind of to be honest, to be blunt, is kind of the bully on the playground, and we are resisting a multipolar world. And we are still trying to have a unipolar world. And then growing adaptation to a warmer climate and ecosystems problems. So conclusions. We as a culture are energy blind. We think of money and technology as kind of what powers society, and that economic growth is kind of our natural birthright, and we ignore the subsidy that we get from ancient coal, oil, and natural gas. Climate change is not the problem. Climate change is a symptom of a much larger dysfunction, which is an exponential growth system tethered to profits, tethered to energy, tethered to carbon energy. The next doubling is expected to happen in the next 30 years, and another doubling after that. Is the next doubling possible? What if the next doubling does happen? What will happen to our environment and our living conditions? What if the next doubling in the size of the economy doesn't happen? These are really central questions. We're at the day 29 out of 30 where the lily pads double on the pond and the pond is half full sort of situation. We don't need all this energy to be happy and have healthy lives. After basic needs are met, most of the best things in life are free. I expect we'll see a movement away from net worth to self-worth. And there are, I forgot to include the graphs, but above 100 gigajoules per capita, the Human Development Index doesn't increase much. So Italy is about the same human development as the United States, which is 360 gigajoules per capita. We use 3.5 times more energy, no discernible benefit. In fact, people in Europe are living longer, they have better healthcare systems, et cetera. So there is not a direct correlation between more money and more energy and better well-being. Renewables are the answer. They're the right answer to the wrong question. The right question is, how can we use renewable energy technology in tandem with our declining fossil fuels, hopefully not much coal, to have a different society that we use systems and do the entire cosmology of what brought us here. What do we aspire to? And how can we use our incredibly powerful fossil reserves as seed corn towards a different sort of way of living? What I've just conveyed to you today cannot be said on CNN or Fox or in a presidential address because it's too threatening, it's too complex, there are no easy answers, it's in the future, and the popular people and the Kardashians and others are not saying this on YouTube videos. This will never be a super popular story, but it is a bat signal to those people that are pro-social, curious, psychologically mature, and want to play a role in these things. Pathways. Okay, so all governments, corporations, tech, universities are making future funding project grants on growth continuing because it's continued throughout all our lives. What tech governance educational projects will be appropriate for a biophysically smaller, less global future? My work in Jones on my board, our work is focused on 3 areas. When this financial recalibration comes, we want to bend as opposed to break, like a tree in a storm. And what are the things socially, culturally, biophysically, supply chains, more regional and local, et cetera. Another category is stabilize. This has to do a lot with community and social relationships. And when things get tough, you know your neighbors and are doing things. When, as a young person, you decide to define your net worth by your self-worth, and you don't need all these fancy gadgets and things to live a good life, and you have actual skills. So we need to stabilize society, and then finally, and this gets to what Nancy was saying earlier, if she's still here, is we need to kind of expand our definition of empathy to include the natural world, because it's not a me versus we. We are part of the earth, and we are related to each other, and to have something shift in our cultural narrative around the unity and the ecosystems that we are a part of and we are a product of Earth's history. So what is the role of education? I just have one final slide with some suggestions and observations because I don't know what to do, but I'm trying to pass the baton to you people that might have ideas. I firmly believe this, that we underestimate the role teenagers and college-age students can play in our collective future and in our world, worldwide. We underestimate everyone, but we underestimate young people especially. Our current university system also functions as an energy and money-hungry superorganism. So to just tell it needs to be slower and different and have a different metabolism, you can't directly argue with it. There's got to be creative ways to change the system. Higher education, even before the great simplification that I described here, is becoming not an attractive proposition economically to most students. The original idea of a liberal arts education was to get a liberal exposure to all kinds of things of how the world works, and now it's become kind of a rubber stamp to get a job. A new model for college-age humans centered on holistic preparation for likely futures is deeply needed. By holistic, I mean mental, intellectual understanding, but also spiritual, physical, and emotional. A lot of my former students were emotional wrecks, not because they took my class, but they just come in and they're like, you know, what is going on here? They have trauma. We all have trauma. So somewhere there needs to be some deep integrated thinking on how to emotionally and psychologically support young humans. Generalists and systems thinking, integrating head, heart, hands is the model for the future. I am a generalist. Yes, I know a lot about energy, but I've tried to integrate this all into a story. My final slide, when a system is far from equilibrium, small islands of coherence can shift the entire system. I am a proponent of renewable energy, but only once our governance and aspirations change from GDP to something else, and I don't know how to do that. And so changing how we get our energy and how we get all of our consumption with a different means doesn't change the end goal necessarily. Tom, I hope that answered your question. Andrew asked, isn't getting our population issue under control central to all of our other problems? Yes and no. First of all, population, like climate change, is downstream from our economic system. So right now we need babies to buy diapers and toys and janitors for their high schools and iPhones and pensions, et cetera, because it's the bottom end of the pyramid and they keep the economy growing. Secondly, we're not going to just tell people to stop having babies. You think climate change is difficult to convey. Could you imagine in the United States trying to reduce the population? Thirdly, there is a population of humans which is not sustainable. Paul Ehrlich famously and correctly said there is a place for billions of humans on Earth. It's just spread out over time. But we also have populations of refrigerators and jets and lamps and iPhones and computers and things that require a lot of energy. We use over 20 times the energy as the average Filipino. So as a Filipino baby and an American baby, what is the human impact there? So there's a complex nuance between population of people and the energy intensity and consumptive footprint of the people. Personally, my view is that we're not going to solve these issues by changing population other than educating people about population, and maybe people make different choices into the future. My guess is we're going to head towards 9.5 billion people. We're going to have a lot poorer people. So we will have more people, and the average person is going to be a lot poorer than today. And then the second half of this century is when there's potentially giga famine and a decline in population. But wide distribution in what I just described.
Before fossil fuels were used, people were using renewable energy in the form of wood. And people, and using wood, they were able to develop their technologies up to a certain point. And in fact, the development of technology during the Middle Ages far outstripped the regeneration power of the forests. So deforestation has been going on for centuries before the discovery of fossil fuel, which shows that as a species, we didn't need coal. Without coal, it wouldn't have happened, which is an interesting point in itself, or oil and all the whole spectrum. But we were already on our way to this path.
I would say that our Garden of Eden moment was around 10 to 12,000 years ago when we departed hunter-gathering ways of life towards more sedentary, the development of agriculture, which created surplus, and then we started expanding around the earth. You're right, that was one of the impetuses to develop coal, is because we were running out of forest to be able to have the timber and fuel for other processes. We had 500 million people, a few hundred years ago, but were they living sustainably? They were already drawing down soil, et cetera. On the flip side, we have much better technology. Even if it isn't fancy machine technology, we know how to use seeds to grow more food and to intensively interplant crops that we didn't know 200 years ago. So there's a little bit of a change. But you're absolutely right. We were unsustainable long ago. But now the overshoot, which is living above our carrying capacity, is global. Why do I call it the Great Simplification? There are three reasons, but one major scientific reason is as humans advance, and what this gentleman was just saying, is we solve problems by adding complexity to a system. Every time we add complexity to a system via a problem-solving innovation, The nodes of the complexity scale with the square root of half divided by 2 of the nodes within the system. So as we complexify, we require more and more energy. So once more and more energy is not available, a simplification is almost inevitable. It would be my choice, were I a benevolent dictator, that we would voluntarily simplify massively around the Earth first to create kind of like an avalanche gun where you shoot to have mini avalanches instead of the big avalanche. So it's kind of a play on Joseph Tainer's famous book, The Collapse of Complex Societies, which showed that complexity is how we grow. And so the simplification is the opposite. That's number one. The other is that for most of us, especially in the privileged academic elite West, simplifying our lives could actually be a good thing, healthy for our behaviors, et cetera. So my recommendation to people listening, understanding, believing, and wanting to meet the future halfway is to simplify first and beat the rush. But and it's going to be great. This will be the greatest event of our species history, the Great Simplification in my book. It will be epic. And I'm not so optimistic about this culture, but I am optimistic about some human culture emerging, and I'm very optimistic about individual humans responding and playing a role and living exciting lives. I mean, that's the challenge with presentations like this, is because it's scary. And there is fear embedded here. And I do not believe personally that leading with fear is going to really change things in a positive way. We have to at the same time, we have to understand the map that we face. And if we understand the map, like I long ago grieved for the future that humanity and our culture promised me, I've long ago not believed that. So I'm already at a lower expectation. So I'm like completely all in on helping society and playing the role that I have now. I don't make much money now. I used to work on Wall Street and made a lot of money. I'm now paid in things other than money. I'm paid in the collective feeling of this conversation and these meaningful humans playing a role in this. So yes, society is going to simplify, going to be painful and chaotic, but also beautiful and maybe exciting. And so that's kind of how I'm trying to explain it. The question is about educational reform, and is that as important as cultural reform? I would think they're related. I think the sooner we can educate, especially very young humans, not about what I said today, but about how everything is connected, how getting things like oxytocin and serotonin instead of dopamine and handing them a phone or an iPad when you're busy and don't want to deal with them, but to have an integrated experience where these young kids don't develop trauma or addiction, and they also learn a reverence for the natural world. If we have full system humans, we don't need that many of those to play a huge role in our collective future. So this is not a for everyone story, but I do think education needs to change, but I don't know how to change it because the story I'm telling here is going to be really rejected, especially by economists. And every single world leader that I've ever met, like senior politician, every one of them was either themselves an MBA or an econ PhD, or they were flanked by someone as their spokesman. So the neoclassical economists are like the gatekeepers for systems change, and it's very difficult to change that. I think cultural reform, we are probably not going to change as a culture until we're forced to. We are steep discount rated, kind of addicted, polarized society, and if you really understand and believe that, if you really internalize that, it actually, coming out the other side, it motivates you as an individual to make changes now because you know society probably won't. And you get your own house in order, metaphorically speaking, and then you help others and you surround yourself by people that have the same philosophy and worldview. That itself is a huge benefit to change. But I don't have the blueprint on how to change culture and education, but it's a great question.
I feel like teenagers and college age students have more of a tendency to compare like within each other, like in a monetary value. And I feel like teenagers and college age students are more seeking like within their job, they're trying to just make money right now. So I wonder what you see in it.
Yes, you're right, because you have been pulled into the social media marketing story and you haven't been exposed to these things or what is the farm where Ms. Camacho works here?
Life Lab.
Life Lab and things like that, working with the soil, because you're surrounded by other people that have the cultural norms. What I meant by we underestimate them is that's not the path that is the default, that really quickly you or any of your colleagues or friends could change your aspirations away from flexing to have the most money or whatever. It could be possible that not too far in your own future that our culture values kindness and sharing and empathy and intelligence and care for other organisms and ecosystems more than did you build a shopping center and tear down a rainforest so that you had more electrons in your bank account. That is possible. It is not that long ago that the Potlatch Indians, a couple states north of here, they got their status from having enough to give to others. And it was how much they could give to strangers in a potlatch feast that gave them status. So I just think that 12-year-olds, 14-year-olds, 18-year-olds, we underestimate what they could contribute to our world because we just think, oh, they're future workers and consumers, and here's what we should teach them and let them go do all this stuff. And I just mean that it's an incredible resource that by the time you're 30, your myelin sheaths and your neurons are hardened. You're not as behaviorally flexible. You already have a wife or a husband and a baby and a job and a boss. And the options for radical change in your own trajectory have shrunk a little bit. Just widen your surroundings and maybe choose one or two different friends that don't think exactly like that was my short advice. But thanks for the question.
So the mainstream economists that I talk to all seem to like the carbon tax, or at least the ones I know. But when I say, well, politically it doesn't seem to be feasible, they just kind of shrug their shoulders. So it's like the cartoon of the mathematician that puts this long, complex proof on the board, and at the end it says, and then a miracle occurs.
Yeah.
They seem to think that a carbon tax will solve everything. And what's your thought?
Okay, so the question is about a carbon tax. So I'm involved in a project called Untax, which is proposing to replace taxes on humans, which is 95% of our taxes, with a tax not only on carbon, but on all non-renewable resources, like copper, or a fossil water aquifer, or aluminum, or lithium. Anything that is non-renewable on human timescales has a tax on it at the mine mouth, okay? So what that would do is, you're right, if we did that today, and my iPhone, instead of being $400, was $2,000, it would crash the economy. But in the long term, what it would do is it would give the correct price signals to innovators and corporations that, oh my God, this stuff is going to be gone in 20 years. Helium, we have like hardly any helium left. It's a byproduct of natural gas drilling. And so things that we fill up balloons and send them into the sky with helium. But if things like that were more expensive, people would make different innovations and different personal decisions. If you make $40,000 a year now, and you get to keep all 40,000, but the prices of things in the world are more accurately reflecting their long-term scarcity, you will change your behavior on what you buy and sell. I do actually think there's a potential political avenue to this, because Republicans might actually like it as well, because you're no longer taxing corporations. Corporations and individuals pay no tax. The tax is added when we pull out stuff from the ground. I actually think this has a chance of working someday, but it would kind of have to happen when we're in when this great simplification happens. So even though the great simplification will happen because fossil fuels can't keep powering economic growth, paradoxically, at that moment, we will have so many financial claims that people's ability to afford things will decline faster than oil depletion will decline. So we will have $10 oil. or $5 oil and 30% unemployment. And it's at that point where you put in this tax, and it will be a regressive tax, so that it has to be coupled with some sort of a distribution so that poor people don't get priced out. This is really difficult and really complicated, but this is one of those things that actually could work over the next 30 or 40 years because it gives the right signals to the companies and to the people. So the question is, given capitalism's role in exponential growth, how could a different system evolve? Actually, I think everyone that's watching this online can read the questions, so I don't really need to read. Yeah. So first of all, what's happening now is not the fault of capitalism. Capitalism is the manifestation of this dynamic of humans expropriating surplus over the last 10,000 years. And oh, by the way, then we found this turbocharged Super Mario toadstool powerful thing that boosted us up again like this. So capitalism is the economic structure that evolved from this massive energy surplus. So the real driver is our cultural ability to, this gets to cosmology. This gets to the core of the UCSC dynamic, which is understanding that our species is functioning as a metabolic superorganism, a blind, energy-hungry superorganism. Is understanding that enough for us culturally, socially, to change that? Not to get too metaphorical and dark, but it's a little bit like a cancer cell becoming self-aware. And how can we change the economic system away from exponential growth? I think at the core of all of the challenges we've discussed today is governance. We do not have a governance structure capable of handling the challenges ahead of us. And I think we need a lot of alternative models there, because capitalism and, corporations are doing a lot of damage to the planet, but they're just following the rules that we laid out back in the day. And so I know people that are working on, especially they're starting with private corporations, on extending the time horizon of decisions from 3 months, the quarterly earnings, to 10 or 15 years. So if we could extend the time horizons of our investment decisions, that would be one way to moderate capitalism towards more longer term outcomes. My belief is that these kids are much smarter and more perceptive than we realize. We should never, ever dissemble and lie to young kids about these challenges. I think we have to be honest. We have to educate them about the natural world and where food comes from and soil, and give them skills in a positive way, and lead by example, so that they have fond memories and love their grandmother and grandfather that taught them these things, and just prepare them to be good humans. And the future is unknown. Yeah, we're going to have a decline in economic growth. Okay, well, there was lots of conflict and problems in humanity's past that we navigated through. So I think we need a whole system, holistic young people, and that does start from the grandma elephants and grandpa elephants teaching their young, or the second generation, what they've learned. It's a huge untapped resource. And I think grandparents around the world should be passing the baton to their young grandchildren. Energy is important. Choose your friends wisely. The world is uncertain, but a beautiful and magical place. Be curious and learn, and enjoy your life and make a difference in the world that you were born into.
What you were talking about when you tied in this emotional piece to the conversation, like what struck me was almost that you were sort of distinguishing between the difference between happiness versus pleasure, and that perhaps maybe, and this is what I really want you to comment on, but like maybe when as educators, one of the things we could be doing is reimagining science for instance, not only as a means to developing new technology or new knowledge, but also as a means for teaching the people who are studying that science how, like, also studying what pleasure and happiness and well-being really are. Because hedonic happiness is very different, right, from eudaimonic happiness or pleasure or well-being, which can be totally different.
The question pertains to pleasure, well-being, and happiness. First of all, I do not think we evolved to be happy. Happiness was an externality of us going through our daily routines. So happiness is one of the many states that humans have contentment. I think underneath our cognitive system is our limbic system, and we go through life either satisfied or dissatisfied. And unfortunately, our system, our social system and our cultural system is when we're dissatisfied, we have a short circuit IV at our hands that we can get dopamine, which immediately satisfies our initial urge, but it's like non-nutritive food. And so we need to, there's an axis between dopamine and endorphins, which is the doing axis, endorphins from exercise. And there's the axis between serotonin and oxytocin, which is the being axis. But those four things have become a one-legged stool in our culture, and it's dopamine, dopamine, dopamine. And when we're lonely or bored or hungry or whatever, we get dopamine. And so what we need to do is, in your own life, make a list of the things that bring you happiness or pleasure, and how many of them are healthy and use the repertoire of oxytocin and serotonin and other things, and how many are dopamine. And it's almost like keeping a quiver full of arrows on your shoulder, that when you have a craving, when you're dissatisfied and want to be satisfied, you choose from that list of things that gives you the more holistic well-being. And if we had a lot of humans doing that, boy, things would change, I think, quickly. And I'm not only a spokesman for this, but I'm also a client, in that I am struggling with this in my own life. And so I'm trying to do this changing behavior, go for a walk, play with my dogs, read a book rather than do the dopamine activities. I have no idea whether that answered your question, but that was my initial thought.
I think we need to bring this fascinating talk, event, discussion, and gathering to a close. And want to thank you again, Nate, for making the journey here, and your companion, Joan, for making this day possible for us.
And our colleague, Tom Murphy, is on the screen for everyone to see.
Right. So being the cosmologist, I can't resist trying to close this event with a more astronomical perspective. And there was a famous conundrum that was posed by Fermi, the famous nuclear physicist of several decades ago. Namely, if life expands, he had exponential growth in mind on an interstellar scale, why aren't they here? And it's called the Fermi paradox. Why do we not see aliens on our planet if life is destined to expand exponentially? And I think our society might be answering that question. And that is, exponential growth is not possible. And even beyond that, maybe your final slide, or my final slide, would be the quote from Pogo: "We have met the enemy and they are us." So thank you again, Nate, and coming back soon.